So, good morning, everyone. On this Mother's Day, as well as giving appreciation to mothers everywhere, I want to dedicate this to my wife, um, who, uh, mother of our children. And in particular, I want to congratulate my wife on the publication of a major book she's been working on for many years. It's a book published by Palgrave Macmillan, which is a collection of essays by the poet W.S. Merwin. The book is called Reading W.S. Merwin in a New Century, American and European Perspectives, and I was privileged to write a chapter in the book about Merwin's Zen practice and the importance of Zen in his life. And by the way, Merwin was a two-time poet laureate. If you haven't heard of him, he's actually pretty amazing. If you have read W.S. Merwin's poetry, and if you haven't, I highly recommend it. You'll have been struck by how much of it seems influenced by Zen, and yet Buddhism is rarely, if ever, mentioned in his works. My chapter is largely about this, about how his writing is suffused by Zen teachings, and yet in all the interviews he repeatedly denied that Zen had an influence on his writing. Knowing a little about Merwin's life helps to get the picture into focus. Originally hailing from New York, Merwin moves to the Hawaiian island of Maui in the early 1970s in order to be closer to his Zen teacher Robert Aitken, who had moved there in '69. In fact, at first Merwin and his girlfriend live in Aitken's guest house until they find a place of their own to live. And he finds a place, by the way, just in a small village nearby called Haiku, in the north of the island, which sounds like a super fitting place for a poet to live, although in fact this word haiku is Hawaiian and actually means a sharp break or to talk abruptly. Nothing to do with the poetry format, but nonetheless kind of cool, and I think it may have been one of the reasons why he chose it. He never really confessed that to us, but I think it was kind of assumed. But I digress. Despite a lifelong denial of the depth of his Zen practice, it's clear, speaking to those who knew him, and my wife became his friend in the '70s when she wrote the first ever book on his poetry, that he was very serious about his Zen. There is little doubt that he studied for many years with Aitken, practiced Zazen, and did koan introspection with Aitken. Though throughout Merwin's poetry, Zen is present as a flavor or an influence to his writing, particularly from the 1970s onwards, but rarely did he do a direct quote from any Zen teaching. One exception stands out, and it's the reason I titled my chapter in that book, The Fox Sleeps in Plain Sight, Zen in the Poetry of W.S. Merwin. And the reason for this is a poem he wrote simply titled Fox Sleep. What stood out to me about this poem is that the entire middle section of it is a word-for-word quote of the second case in the Gateless Gate, the koan titled Pi Chang Fox. He didn't just borrow a few words from the second case or borrow the general idea. He puts the entire koan into the middle of his poem, without anywhere mentioning that these are not his words and that they're words of an ancient Chinese text. If you're interested in his poem Fox Sleep, then I highly recommend it. But it's lengthy, and in the interest of time, I won't recite it all here today. In the poem, he describes 3 encounters with a fox. First is his discovery of a metal ring in an old mill, carved in the shape of a fox chasing its tail. How, as you grind the grain with a hand mill, you would have the fox going round and round, chasing its tail endlessly. There's symbolism in that, which is typical of Merwin's writing. Then the following middle section is the entirety of the koan from the Gateless Gate, more about which in a moment. And then last he recounts how he went for a walk one day and came across a vixen dead on the path before him, and he took the vixen home and buried her in his garden. Again, the symbolism of that will become more apparent when we dive into the koan. But before considering the koan itself, I want to mention that in Robert Aitken's annotated version of Gateless Gate, Aitken mentions that before he moved to Hawaii, he was living in Southern California, and he went for a walk one day in the woods and came across a vixen playing with some paper that was floating around in the wind. It's kind of a cute description. He says that it was kind of like a sheet of newspaper or something. The vixen would sort of stomp on the paper to stop it blowing around, look up at him, he says, almost as if smiling, let the paper go so it fly around again, and then have fun just jumping on it to stop it again, once again looking up at him as if to say, are you enjoying my play? And then something changes, he doesn't say what, and the vixen just runs off into the woods. Now, I've got no doubt whatsoever that Aitken told this story to Merwin, and indeed Merwin probably read it in Aitken's copy of The Gateless Gate, which is undoubtedly where Merwin got his koan from, to quote in the poem. Now for the koan itself. So this is case number 2 from The Gateless Gate. And because it was convenient, I actually grabbed the exact version that Aitken gives, and I'm pretty sure it's very close to one-to-one match to what Merwin has put in his poem. Once when Pi Chang gave a series of talks, a certain old man was always there listening together with the monks. When they left, he would leave too. One day, however, he remained behind, and Pi Chang asked him, "Who are you, standing there before me?" The old man replied, "I am not a human being. In the far distant past, in the time of Kapasa Buddha, I was the head priest at this mountain. One day, a monk asked me, 'Does an enlightened person fall under the law of cause and effect or not?' I replied, 'Such a person does not fall under the law of cause and effect.' With this, I was reborn 500 times as a fox. Please say a turning word for me and release me from the body of a fox." He then asked Pei Chang, "Does an enlightened person fall under the law of cause and effect or not?" And Pai Chang said, "Such a person does not evade the law of cause and effect." Hearing this, the old man was immediately enlightened. Making his bows, he said, "I am released from the body of a fox. The body is on the other side of this mountain. I wish to make a request of you. Please, Abbot, perform my funeral as if for a priest." Pai Chang had the head monk strike the signal board and inform the assembly that all afternoon meal there would be a funeral service for a priest. The monks talked about this and in wonder, "All of us are well. There's nobody in the morgue. What does this teacher mean?" After the meal, Pai Chang led the monks to the foot of a rock on the far side of the mountain, and there with his staff he poked out the body of a dead fox. He then performed the ceremony of cremation, and that evening he took the high seat before his assembly and told the monks the whole story. Huang Po stepped forward and said, "As you say, the old man missed the turning word and was reborn as a fox 500 times. What if he'd given the right answer each time he was asked the question? What would have happened then?" Pai Chang said, "Step up here, closer, I'll tell you." Huang Po went up to Pai Chang and slapped him in the face. Pai Chang clapped his hands and laughed, saying, "I thought the barbarian had a red beard, but here is a red-bearded barbarian." That's the end of the koan. So a couple of observations. First, the old man, if you like the fox, mentions he was the head priest at that mountain in the time of Kassapa Buddha. Now, Kassapa Buddha is one of the Buddhas of antiquity who preceded Gautama Buddha. In fact, he is the Buddha that came immediately before Gautama, although he came a very long time before Gautama. I tried to refresh my memory on this. I don't know exactly how long before, but there are 5 Buddhas in the current Kalpa, and there's Kassapa, followed after some time by Gautama, and then after some further time there'll be the future Buddha, Maitreya. So immediately we get the message that this story, this koan, has more than a hint of symbolism and metaphor in it. I mean, you have to ask yourself, was there a monastery on that hill in Japan? No, in China. Take it back. 1,000, 2,000 years before Buddha. I don't know. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. Maybe this is symbolic. Maybe this is metaphorical. Moreover, the tradition was that the head priest of a temple takes his name from the mountain. Thus, Pi Chang takes his name from the mountain Pi Chang the temple is located on, which means this old man, this fox, is also Pi Chang, since by identifying himself as the head priest from eons before, he was also essentially saying, my name too is Pi Chang. So it's very, very old Pi Chang is speaking to the current Pi Chang at that time. The second observation is the prominent role in Chinese folklore of the fox, and as in Western folklore, in Chinese culture the fox is tricky, dishonest, and unreliable. Fox spirits appear in numerous Chinese folklore stories and can be a presence for good or a bad omen. They're kind of like black cats as familiars for witches. Foxes are familiars for witch-like people in the Chinese tradition as well. There are shrines all over China to foxes, not because they're revered, sorry, but because they are a spirit you wish to appease and keep satisfied and happy. What I find very interesting about the folklore of a fox in Chinese mythology is the widely held belief that these spirit foxes can live very, very long lives, and that by tradition, around 500 years old, they reach enlightenment and are able to take the form of a human being. So there's really strong parallels here between Chinese folklore that would have been well known, of course, at the time that the Gateless Gate was being written by, and the what the wording of the koan. I'm fairly sure that it wasn't a coincidence, in other words, that it was 500 lifetimes that he'd been a fox, and now he suddenly appears as a human being listening to this person's talks. It just is a perfect fit for Chinese folklore. So let's get back to the koan. The basic question seems simple enough. Is an enlightened, fully realized person still subject to the law of karma? I think it's no coincidence that this is the second case in the Gateless Gate, following the famous one, the Koan Mu. And by the way, over the last couple of days, the Koan Mu came up on Master's Jeopardy, where they said, what is the answer to a famous Zen koan? I forget the exact wording. And they said it was definitively Mu. If I'd been there, I would have said no, Wu. And had a nice little argument about it, but I digress again. But Zen made it into jeopardy over the past couple of days. Mu gets everywhere. What can I say? There we have the teaching of Buddha that all sentient beings have Buddha nature. But asked if a dog has Buddha nature, Joshu says Wu or Mu in Japanese, which means no or not. How can that be? And here we're dealing with a similar issue of Buddha's teaching. The whole point, the whole idea of attaining enlightenment, achieving liberation, is to purify all past karma, and thus, with no residual karma, there's no cause for return or rebirth, because the fully realized Buddha has harmonized completely with essential nature. This is still fairly central to a lot of Asian Buddhism, particularly Theravada. But far from being liberated, old Pai Chang has been enslaved for 500 lifetimes as a fox for mistakenly, and I put that in quotes in what I wrote, saying that he was when enlightened person will be set free from the laws of karma. What's really being asked about here is that back in mythological times before Gautama Buddha, the old Pai Chang was asked about the two worlds of karma and essential nature. Here then is our connection with the Mu Koan. For what is being referenced here by the writer of this koan is that Buddha said all beings are Tathagata, that is, all beings are Buddha, or if you like, all beings have Buddha nature. This essential purity, that it is your true self, is inherently free from the laws of karma. But as Buddha also added, their delusions and preoccupations keep them from testifying to that fact. Buddha nature is serene, it doesn't come and go, it's always at rest. And on the other hand, everything is connected, everything depends on everything else. Thus, karma and no karma are inextricably mixed. Life and death, no life and no death, are all illusionary, since they all only seem to be separate matters. In this story, we meet Huang Po again, the key historical figure that Dave introduced us to in a recent talk. An imposing figure by all accounts, 7 feet tall with a muscular build. Huang Po says the old man missed the turning word. and was born 500 times as a fox. Now, what if he'd given the right answer every time? And Pi Chang says, "Come over here and I'll tell you." Whereupon this veritable mountain of a man, Huang Po, pops over to the master and slaps him in the face. This reminds me of my first physics class at university on relativity. We were all pretty excited to have this class. It was, probably one of the main reasons a lot of us signed up for physics. And as we settled in our seats in the lecture hall, without having said any word up to this point, the professor suddenly threw the blackboard eraser against the far wall behind us from all the way up in the front by the blackboard. And he said, rather more shouted, "If any of you wish to argue that the eraser hit the wall before I threw it, you can leave my class now." There is cause, there is effect. As the Mandalorians say, this is the way. So how does this speak to our everyday practice? If you say, "I'm a regular human being with arms, legs, body, head, 2 eyes and a nose," the master will say, "Really? What's it like walking around in that skin sack with 2 holes in it? Surely it's dark and claustrophobic in there." And if you say, "I'm awakened and no longer subject to cause and effect because I've realized my true nature, I'm one with everything," the master will come over and slap you in the face, asking, "Really? What was that then?" The trickster, the fox, seduces us into a firm belief in good and bad, right and wrong, calls us to choose the relative or the absolute, karma or essential nature. We need to build a shrine to appease this scoundrel, rising above this and that, realizing we're not subject to the laws of karma, and yet we are totally subject to the laws of karma, and seeing that they are one and the same. Wu Men's verse spells this out. Not falling, not evading, 2 faces of the same die. Not evading, not falling, 1,000 mistakes, 10,000 mistakes. The relative and the absolute are 2 sides of the same thing. So long as we're focused on the mistakes we make and our regret for them, and we live in constant regretting, then we can't experience the non-dual nature of things. And here I recall my early experience of doing koan work with a teacher at the Zen Center of Los Angeles many, many years ago. And there the teacher will typically give you between 10 seconds and maybe a few minutes to present your current koan that you've been assigned. Utter a few words that are not what the teacher is looking for to pass you on a koan, and the bell would ring to abruptly end the session and boot you out of the room. This teaching method may work for some people, but I found it held me back from realization rather than encouraging it. The method seemed focused on intentionally causing frustration in the student, and I would spend the intervening week between meetings with the teacher regretting the presentation I'd given and being wrung out for, going round in circles, feeling the alternative response I had in mind was what I really should have said or done instead. Its constant regret blinded me to the non-dual nature the koan was supposedly meant to be encouraging in me. Personally, I found I built 2 shrines to appease the fox that would keep me stuck in a cycle of regret that prevented me from awakening to non-duality. One shrine is simply sitting on a cushion in Zazen. Trickster Fox hates it when we do that. And the second was to find a good teacher who would take the time to dialogue with me about each koan, rather than deliberately trying to frustrate me with them and throw me into that vicious circle of regret. Trust me, these spirit foxes hate it when you have a good teacher walking the path with you, encouraging you along the way. So it's been said that you understand the story of Pai Chang and the fox to the extent that you understand yourself. So how did this speak to you? If it did, how does this relate to your life and your Zen practice? Thank you.